Every single day, roughly 1.3 billion cigarettes are lit around the world, and about 2.6 billion cups of alcohol are poured. Now, that's not a moral judgment, that's a starting point. Because here's the thing about those numbers. They don't just tell you what people consume. They tell you how people think, or more accurately, how they fail to think. Studies published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health found a consistent, measurable link between lower cognitive ability in childhood and higher rates of smoking and heavy drinking in adulthood. Kids who scored lower on intelligence tests at age 11 were significantly more likely to become regular smokers and problem drinkers by their 30s. Not because they lacked willpower, not because they came from worse neighborhoods, although that plays a role, but because the cognitive architecture that helps someone evaluate long-term consequences, weigh risks against immediate pleasure, and override impulse with foresight. That architecture was weaker from the start. And before anyone gets defensive, this isn't about calling smokers or drinkers stupid. Plenty of brilliant people smoke. Plenty of sharp minds enjoy a drink. The research isn't pointing at individuals. It's pointing at patterns. Population-level patterns that show up again and again across decades of data, across countries, across demographics. The correlation between substance use and lower cognitive scores isn't about personal failure. It's about a specific kind of decision-making deficit that psychology has been tracking for over 50 years. But cigarettes and alcohol are just the surface, the visible tip of something much deeper. Because intelligence, or the lack of it, doesn't just show up in what people put in their bodies. It shows up in how they argue, how they plan, how they treat strangers, how they react to being wrong, and how they navigate a world that rewards long-term thinking and punishes impulsive shortcuts. This is where things get interesting. Psychologists have spent decades cataloging the behavioral fingerprints of low cognitive ability. Not the obvious ones. Not the kind you'd spot on a test. The subtle, everyday behaviors that reveal how someone's brain processes information, handles complexity, and responds to uncertainty. And some of these behaviors are so common, so normalized, that most people never even recognize them as signs of anything at all. So let's start with one of the most well-documented patterns in the entire field of intelligence research, the Dunning-Kruger Effect. Most people have heard the name by now, but very few understand what the original research actually showed. In 1999, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger at Cornell University ran a series of experiments that would reshape how we think about self-awareness. They tested participants on logic, grammar, and humor. Then they asked those same participants to estimate how well they'd done compared to everyone else. The results were brutal. The people who scored in the bottom quarter consistently rated their own performance as above average. Not slightly above average. Way above average. Meanwhile, the highest performers slightly underestimated themselves. Here's what Dunning himself later explained. The skills you need to produce a correct answer are the exact same skills you need to recognize what a correct answer looks like. So if you lack the ability, you also lack the ability to know you lack the ability. That's not arrogance. That's a cognitive blind spot baked into the structure of incompetence itself. And this shows up everywhere. The person at the dinner party who speaks the loudest about geopolitics but can't name 3 countries in the Middle East. The coworker who insists their strategy is flawless and refuses to hear feedback. The online commenter who writes 6 paragraphs of confident wrongness without a single source. These aren't personality quirks. According to the research, they're behavioral signatures of lower cognitive functioning. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets darker. Because when clarity drops, confidence doesn't disappear. It gets louder. Mental noise fills the gaps where understanding should be. And if you want to protect your own thinking from slipping into that kind of cognitive fog, take a look at the brain song. It's a science-based method designed to pull the brain out of mental overload and bring it back into real focus in just 12 minutes a day. You'll find the link in the first pinned comment. Because the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just about overestimating your own knowledge. It's about being fundamentally unable to calibrate your confidence to your actual competence. And that inability bleeds into every area of life. Relationships, career decisions, financial planning, health choices. When someone can't accurately assess what they don't know, they can't ask for help. They can't learn from mistakes. They can't course correct. They're driving blind and convinced they have perfect vision. Now let's talk about something that sounds almost too simple to be a marker of intelligence. But the data is overwhelming. It's the inability to delay gratification. Back in the late 1960s, psychologist Walter Mischel ran what became one of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology, the Stanford marshmallow test. He put a marshmallow in front of a child and said, "You can eat this one now, or wait 15 minutes and get 2 marshmallows. Simple choice." But the follow-up data, tracked over decades, was staggering. The children who waited, who could sit with discomfort and override their immediate impulse, went on to have higher SAT scores, lower rates of substance abuse, better stress management, lower body mass indexes, and stronger social skills. And the children who grabbed the marshmallow immediately were more likely, statistically, significantly more likely, to struggle across nearly every measurable life outcome. Now, the marshmallow test has faced some valid criticism. Researchers at New York University replicated the study with a larger, more diverse sample, and found that socioeconomic factors explained a significant portion of the results. Kids from unstable environments had rational reasons not to wait. They'd learned from experience that promises don't always get kept. Fair point. But even after controlling for income, family education, and home environment, the ability to delay gratification still predicted cognitive outcomes. It wasn't the whole picture, but it was a real piece of the puzzle. And in adults, this pattern becomes even more pronounced. People with lower cognitive ability are measurably more likely to choose smaller, immediate rewards over larger, delayed ones. This shows up in financial behavior, taking payday loans at 300% interest instead of waiting 2 weeks. It shows up in health decisions, skipping exercise today because the couch feels better right now, even knowing the long-term cost. It shows up in relationships, saying the hurtful thing in the moment instead of pausing and choosing a response that serves the bigger picture. The weird part is, most people who struggle with delayed gratification don't see it as a thinking problem. They see it as a discipline problem. But researchers at the University of Colorado found that the ability to delay gratification is strongly correlated with working memory capacity, which is one of the most reliable proxies for general intelligence. The people who can hold multiple pieces of information in their mind simultaneously, the reward now versus the reward later versus the consequences of each, are the same people who can override their impulses. It's not willpower, it's processing power. Pretty clever research, right? But this is where things get really uncomfortable, because there's another behavior that shows up with remarkable consistency in the intelligence literature, and it's one that most people would never connect to cognitive ability. It's black and white thinking, the tendency to see the world in absolutes, good or evil, right or wrong, for us or against us, with no room for nuance, complexity, or gray area. Psychologists call it dichotomous thinking, and research published in the journal Intelligence found a significant negative correlation between cognitive ability and the tendency to view issues in binary terms. In other words, the lower someone scores on measures of fluid intelligence, the more likely they are to sort the world into 2 neat categories and resist any information that complicates the picture. Here's the thing about black and white thinking. It's not laziness. It's a cognitive shortcut that the brain uses when it doesn't have the processing resources to handle complexity. Holding 2 contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time, evaluating partial evidence, accepting that something can be simultaneously true and false depending on context, that takes serious mental bandwidth. And when that bandwidth is limited, the brain defaults to the simplest possible framework: yes or no, good or bad, all or nothing. This is why lower cognitive ability is consistently associated with higher levels of prejudice. Not because less intelligent people are morally worse, but because prejudice is, at its core, an oversimplification. It's the brain saying, I don't have the resources to evaluate each person individually, so I'll sort them into groups and assign fixed characteristics to those groups. A study by Gordon Hodson and Michael Busseri at Brock University found that lower childhood intelligence predicted greater racism in adulthood, even after controlling for education and socioeconomic status. The mechanism wasn't hatred, it was cognitive economy, the brain taking the cheapest available shortcut. And this connects to another behavior that the research flags consistently: resistance to changing one's mind. Sounds crazy, right? Because everyone thinks they're open-minded. But studies in the journal Thinking and Reasoning found that people with higher cognitive ability are significantly more likely to update their beliefs when presented with new evidence. They're better at what psychologists call belief revision. And people with lower cognitive ability tend to anchor to their initial position and treat contradictory evidence as a personal attack rather than useful information. This is called the anchoring effect on steroids, and it explains a phenomenon that anyone who's ever argued on the internet has witnessed. The person who doubles down harder, the more wrong they're proven to be. That's not stubbornness in the traditional sense. That's a brain that lacks the cognitive flexibility to rebuild its model of reality on the fly. Changing your mind requires dismantling an existing belief structure and constructing a new one. That's expensive, cognitively speaking. And when your cognitive budget is tight, the brain would rather defend the existing structure than pay the construction cost of a new one. Now here's something that might surprise people. One of the strongest behavioral predictors of low intelligence isn't something loud or obvious. It's a quiet thing. It's the failure to ask questions. Research from the Harvard Business Review, drawing on data from multiple cognitive studies, found that curiosity is one of the most reliable indicators of intellectual capacity. Not just book curiosity. Active, engaged, I need to understand this curiosity. The kind that drives someone to ask why, instead of just accepting what they're told. People with higher cognitive ability ask more questions, ask better questions, and are more comfortable admitting they don't know something. Because for them, not knowing isn't a threat. It's an opportunity. People with lower cognitive ability, on the other hand, tend to treat questions as admissions of weakness. They avoid asking because asking reveals a gap, and revealing a gap feels dangerous. So instead of inquiring, they assume. Instead of investigating, they accept the first explanation that makes sense. And over time, this creates an ever-widening knowledge gap, not because they can't learn, but because they've stopped feeding the machine that drives learning. Makes sense, right? But wait. Because there's a related behavior that's even more telling. It's the inability to think about thinking. Psychologists call it metacognition, the awareness of your own cognitive processes. Knowing what you know, knowing what you don't know, and knowing how you came to believe what you believe. Research published in the journal Psychological Science found that metacognitive ability is strongly correlated with general intelligence. People with higher cognitive ability are better at monitoring their own thought processes, catching their own errors, and recognizing when their reasoning has gone off track. And people with lower metacognitive ability? They don't just make more mistakes, they make mistakes without noticing. They reach conclusions without examining the reasoning that got them there. They hold beliefs without understanding where those beliefs came from. And when someone points out a flaw in their logic, they experience it not as helpful feedback, but as a personal violation. Because they can't separate their identity from their ideas. The ideas aren't conclusions they've reached. The ideas are them. And questioning the ideas feels like questioning their existence. This connects to something fascinating that behavioral economists have studied extensively. The sunk cost fallacy. The tendency to continue investing in something, a relationship, a business, a project, a belief, simply because you've already invested so much. Rationally, past investment shouldn't influence future decisions. What's spent is spent. The only question that matters is whether the future returns justify the future costs. But people with lower cognitive ability are dramatically more susceptible to sunk cost reasoning. They can't let go of bad investments, bad strategies, bad relationships, because their brains can't separate the emotional weight of past effort from the rational calculation of future value. Simple math, really. But the brain doesn't always do math. Sometimes it does emotion dressed up as math. And the less cognitive horsepower someone has, the harder it is to tell the difference. Here's another one that researchers have flagged, and it's going to hit close to home for a lot of people. Chronic complaining. Not the occasional venting that everyone does. The persistent, repetitive, everything is terrible pattern that some people fall into and never climb out of. A study from Clemson University found that habitual complaining is associated with lower levels of cognitive flexibility. The ability to shift your thinking when circumstances change. People who complain chronically aren't just unhappy. They're cognitively stuck. Their brains have locked onto a negative interpretation framework and lack the processing power to generate alternative perspectives. The real secret is that complaining feels productive. It feels like problem solving. But it's actually the opposite. Problem solving requires identifying the issue, generating potential solutions, evaluating those solutions, and implementing the best one. Complaining stops at step one and runs it on a loop. And for people with limited cognitive resources, that loop feels like the whole process because they can't see the steps they're skipping. Nobody tells you about this next one, but it might be the most important behavioral marker on the entire list. It's the inability to understand other people's perspectives. Psychologists call it theory of mind, the capacity to recognize that other people have thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and motivations that are different from your own. And while theory of mind develops in most children by age 4 or 5, the sophistication with which adults use it varies enormously. And that variation tracks closely with cognitive ability. Research from the University of Edinburgh found that adults with higher intelligence scores performed significantly better on advanced theory of mind tasks, the ability to predict how someone would react to a situation, understand why someone might hold a belief that seems irrational, or navigate complex social dynamics where multiple people have conflicting but internally consistent viewpoints. Lower cognitive ability was associated with a flatter, less nuanced model of other people. Not cruelty, not indifference. Just a simpler map. A map that says, everyone basically thinks like I do, and anyone who doesn't is either wrong or weird. And this maps directly onto another well-documented pattern: the tendency to personalize everything. People with lower cognitive ability are more likely to interpret neutral events as directed at them personally. Someone cuts them off in traffic, and it's a deliberate act of disrespect rather than someone who didn't see them. A friend cancels plans, and it's a rejection rather than a scheduling conflict. A coworker gets promoted, and it's favoritism rather than merit. This isn't paranoia, it's a cognitive limitation. The brain doesn't have enough bandwidth to generate multiple explanations for an event, so it defaults to the one that requires the least computation. The one where everything revolves around the self. This is where things get tricky, because the next behavior on the list sounds almost identical, but operates through a completely different mechanism. It's the tendency to blame external factors for personal failures, while taking credit for successes. Psychologists call it the self-serving attribution bias, and while everyone does it to some degree, research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that the bias is significantly stronger in individuals with lower cognitive ability. Here's why. Accurately attributing outcomes to their real causes requires complex causal reasoning. You have to consider multiple contributing factors, weigh their relative importance, and accept that your own behavior played a specific measurable role. That's hard. That requires the kind of analytical thinking that correlates directly with intelligence. And when that capacity is limited, the brain defaults to the simplest causal model available. Either I did something great, or something external did something terrible to me. There's no middle ground because the middle ground requires too many variables. And this feeds into a cycle that's almost impossible to break from the inside. When you can't accurately attribute your failures to their real causes, you can't fix those causes. You just keep running into the same walls and blaming the walls. One guy who's been studying this cycle for over 20 years, psychologist Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, calls it learned helplessness. When someone consistently attributes negative outcomes to external, permanent, and pervasive factors, the world is unfair, the system is rigged, nothing ever works for me, they stop trying. Not because they're lazy, but because their cognitive model says trying is pointless. That's not a typo. Lower cognitive ability makes people more vulnerable to hopelessness. Not because they face harder circumstances, although many do, but because their brains build simpler causal models of the world, and simpler models are more likely to produce all-or-nothing conclusions. Everything is broken. Nothing will change. Trying is pointless. Now let's talk about a behavior that might seem disconnected from intelligence but is actually deeply linked: the compulsive need to be entertained. Research from the University of York found that individuals with lower cognitive ability report significantly higher levels of boredom, susceptibility, and are more likely to seek constant external stimulation. They reach for their phones more often. They switch between tasks more frequently. They struggle more with silence, solitude, and unstructured time. Here's the thing about boredom. It's not the absence of stimulation. It's the inability to generate internal stimulation. People with rich inner cognitive lives, active imaginations, complex thought patterns, the ability to puzzle through problems in their heads, don't depend on the external world to keep them engaged. They carry their entertainment system in their skulls. But when that internal system is limited, boredom becomes a constant companion, and the need for external novelty becomes a need, not a preference. This is why studies consistently find that screen time, specifically passive screen time like scrolling social media without purpose, is negatively correlated with cognitive ability in adults. Not because screens make people less intelligent, although there's a separate debate about that, but because people with lower cognitive ability are drawn to passive consumption because active engagement, reading a book, solving a problem, having a complex conversation, requires resources they find more depleting. Pretty uncomfortable stuff, right? But here's the behavior that researchers say ties all of these together into a single unified pattern. It's the one behavior that predicts nearly every other item on this list. And it's something so simple that it almost sounds ridiculous. It's the failure to plan. Research from the National Institute of Mental Health found that the ability to formulate and execute plans, what psychologists call executive function, is the cognitive skill most strongly correlated with general intelligence. People with higher cognitive ability naturally think further ahead. They consider more contingencies. They build mental models of possible futures and make decisions based on where they want to end up, not just where they are right now. People with lower cognitive ability tend to operate in what researchers call the extended present, a narrow window of time that includes right now and maybe a few hours from now, but rarely extends to next week, next month, or next year. They're not incapable of planning in theory, but the cognitive cost of projecting into the future, modeling multiple scenarios, and choosing between them is high enough that they default to reactive behavior instead. They deal with things as they come. They respond to emergencies rather than preventing them. They make decisions based on the current emotional state rather than a long-term strategic vision. And this is where the research comes full circle to where it started. Because that failure to plan, that inability to project consequences into the future, is exactly the mechanism that drives the link between lower cognitive ability and substance use. Smoking a cigarette feels good right now. The health consequences are abstract, distant, and uncertain. Drinking heavily tonight is pleasurable in the moment. The hangover, the missed opportunities, the long-term organ damage, those exist in a future that the extended present can't reach. Military survival training teaches something called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. And the research on intelligence and behavior suggests that people with lower cognitive ability tend to skip the first 3 steps and jump straight to act. They see a stimulus and they respond. They feel an impulse and they follow it. Not because they're broken, not because they're lesser, but because the cognitive infrastructure that allows someone to pause between stimulus and response, to insert a layer of analysis between what happens and what you do about it, is the same infrastructure measured by intelligence tests. Experienced researchers in this field figured out something important decades ago. Intelligence isn't about what you know. It's about what you do with what you know. It's about the gap between information and action. It's about the ability to override your first instinct, consider alternatives, project consequences, and choose the response that serves your long-term interests, even when it costs you in the short term. And here's what makes all of this both sobering and strangely hopeful. Intelligence isn't entirely fixed. The behaviors on this list aren't death sentences. Metacognition can be taught. Delayed gratification can be practiced. Black and white thinking can be challenged. Curiosity can be cultivated. Planning skills can be developed. The cognitive shortcuts that characterize lower intelligence aren't permanent features of the brain. They're default settings. And default settings can be changed. But they can only be changed by someone who first recognizes that the default settings exist. And that might be the ultimate marker of intelligence. Not how smart you are, but whether you're willing to look at your own thinking, find the flaws, and do the hard, uncomfortable work of rewiring them. But here's a behavior that nobody talks about, and the research on it is absolutely fascinating. It's the tendency to confuse correlation with causation. Sounds like a statistics lesson, right? But it's not. It shows up in everyday thinking more than almost any other logical error, and it maps directly onto cognitive ability. A study published in the journal Cognition tested participants' ability to distinguish between correlational data and causal claims. The researchers gave people descriptions of studies, some showing genuine cause and effect relationships, others showing mere statistical associations, and asked them to evaluate the conclusions. People with higher cognitive ability were dramatically better at spotting the difference. They could look at a statement like, people who eat breakfast tend to weigh less, and recognize that this doesn't mean breakfast causes weight loss. Maybe healthier people are more likely to eat breakfast in the first place. Maybe income plays a role. Maybe the relationship disappears once you control for exercise habits. People with lower cognitive ability, on the other hand, tended to accept the surface-level claim. Breakfast causes weight loss. Done. Moving on. And this isn't a trivial distinction. This is the cognitive difference between someone who gets manipulated by every headline, every advertisement, every political talking point, and someone who pauses to ask, wait, is that actually how it works? Here's where it gets really practical. This confusion between correlation and causation is the exact mechanism behind conspiracy thinking. Research from the University of Oregon found that belief in conspiracy theories is significantly correlated with lower scores on analytical thinking tests. Not because conspiracy believers are gullible in some simple way, but because conspiracy thinking is fundamentally a pattern-matching error. The brain detects a coincidence. Two events happen near each other in time, and immediately assigns a causal relationship. The vaccine came out, and then someone got sick, so the vaccine caused the sickness. A politician visited a city, and then a policy changed, so the visit was the cause. The brain is doing what brains do, looking for patterns. But without the cognitive resources to evaluate whether those patterns are real or illusory, every coincidence becomes evidence. Experienced psychologists figured out years ago that this isn't about education. You can have a graduate degree and still fall into correlation-causation traps if your analytical thinking capacity is limited. Education gives you knowledge. Intelligence gives you the ability to use that knowledge correctly. They're related, but they're not the same thing. And this connects to another behavior that shows up with remarkable consistency in the research: the tendency to overgeneralize from personal experience. One guy gets food poisoning at a Mexican restaurant, and suddenly all Mexican food is dangerous. Someone has a bad experience with a mechanic from a particular background, and the entire group gets labeled untrustworthy. A friend tries a diet and loses weight, so the diet must work for everyone. Psychologists call this the availability heuristic, combined with base rate neglect, and research from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two of the most influential psychologists in history, showed that it's one of the most pervasive cognitive biases in human thinking. But here's the thing. Everyone falls prey to it sometimes. The difference is in degree. People with higher cognitive ability are better at catching themselves. They notice when they're generalizing from a single data point. They instinctively seek out additional evidence before forming a conclusion. They have an internal alarm system that says, wait, one example isn't enough. People with lower cognitive ability don't have that alarm, or if they do, it rings quieter. So personal experience becomes universal truth, and a sample size of one becomes sufficient evidence for a lifetime belief. Now, there's one more behavior that the research highlights, and it might be the most socially visible one on this entire list. It's the way people handle disagreements. Not just the positions they take, but the mechanics of how they argue. Research from the University of Illinois found that people with higher cognitive ability are significantly more likely to engage in what psychologists call integrative complexity, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously and find connections between opposing viewpoints. They don't just argue for their side. They can articulate the other side's position, sometimes better than the other side can. They're capable of what philosophers call steel manning, building the strongest possible version of their opponent's argument before responding to it. People with lower cognitive ability tend to rely on what the research calls single-dimension argumentation. They pick one point, one angle, one piece of evidence, and hammer it repeatedly. If that doesn't work, they get louder. If getting louder doesn't work, they get personal. The escalation pattern is remarkably predictable. Argument fails, volume increases. Volume fails, the topic shifts from the issue to the person. This isn't a communication style. It's a cognitive limitation. The brain doesn't have the bandwidth to generate new arguments on the fly, so it does the only thing it can: intensify the arguments it already has. Veterans of debate and negotiation know this instinctively. The person who raises their voice first in an argument is almost always the person who ran out of ideas first. That's not a cliché. That's cognitive resource depletion in real time. And here's one final piece of the puzzle that ties everything together. It's something that sounds almost philosophical, but the science behind it is rock solid. People with lower cognitive ability have a measurably harder time tolerating ambiguity. They need answers. They need closure. They need things to be settled, categorized, and filed away. A study published in the Journal of Personality found that the need for cognitive closure, the desire to have a definite answer rather than sitting with uncertainty, is inversely correlated with measures of fluid intelligence. This is why certain people gravitate toward belief systems that offer total, comprehensive, unchallengeable explanations for everything. Not because those systems are true, but because they're complete. They leave no loose ends, no open questions, no uncomfortable maybe. And for a brain that struggles with ambiguity, a wrong answer that feels certain is more comfortable than a right answer that feels uncertain. The real world, of course, is nothing but ambiguity. Every important question has multiple valid answers. Every complex problem has trade-offs. Every decision involves uncertainty. And the ability to function effectively in that ambiguity, to make good decisions without complete information, to act despite uncertainty, to hold provisional beliefs that you're willing to update. That's not just intelligence. That's the practical application of intelligence. It's where cognitive ability meets real life. So here's the full picture. The behaviors that reveal low intelligence aren't about knowing facts or doing math in your head. They're about how someone's brain manages complexity, handles uncertainty, projects into the future, models other people's minds, evaluates evidence, and regulates impulses. They're about the invisible cognitive infrastructure that sits beneath every decision, every conversation, every judgment a person makes. And the uncomfortable truth, the one that makes this research so important, is that most of these behaviors are invisible to the people who exhibit them. That's not a coincidence. That's the fundamental nature of cognitive limitation. The thing that's limited is the very thing you'd need to detect the limitation. It's like trying to see your own blind spot. The system that would alert you to the problem is the same system that has the problem. But here's where it gets hopeful again. Awareness is the first step, and awareness can come from outside. It can come from education, from exposure to different perspectives, from deliberate practice in the specific skills that intelligence demands: critical thinking, perspective-taking, planning, impulse control, comfort with ambiguity. The research is clear that these aren't fixed traits. They're trainable capacities. The brain is plastic. It changes in response to what you demand of it. The question isn't whether any of these behaviors describe you. Everyone recognizes themselves in at least a few items on this list. That's human. The question is what you do next. Do you dismiss it, get defensive, and scroll to the next video? Or do you sit with the discomfort, examine your own thinking honestly, and start building the cognitive habits that separate reactive minds from reflective ones? Because that choice, right there, might be the most accurate intelligence test of all.